Hello, retro gaming fans. I'm back once again with a list that you have been asking for. A few months ago, we did a video about NES games that were based on R-rated movies, and there was just more movies that needed to be covered, so here we are. For those of you that didn't watch the first video, feel free to go back and check it out. But otherwise, it was just the fact that it was kind of strange that we had these games for a system that was geared towards families, but yet still made games based on R-rated movies. You're essentially marketing to kids these super violent movies, and well, let's play games that are based on them. One last little caveat before we get started is that this list is going to focus on the NES versions of these games if they are multi-platform. First up on the list is Alien 3, released in March of 1993, which is admittedly later on in the life cycle of the NES. While there previously had been games made for both Alien and Aliens, the first two movies in the series, it wasn't until Part 3 that we were able to get a game on the Nintendo system. Alien 3, the movie, was released on May 22nd, 1992 by 20th Century Fox. It's obviously the third movie in the franchise and was directed by David Fincher. If that name sounds familiar to you, it's because he was a famous music video director that directed videos from the likes of Rick Springfield, Eddie Money, Loverboy, Foreigner, Steve Winwood, Paula Abdul, and more, including Madonna's Express Yourself and Vogue videos, and one of the ones that sticks out to me the most, Aerosmith's Janie's Got a Gun video. After making his name in music videos, he decided to get into feature-length films, and Alien 3 was his first try at it. Unfortunately, the studio kept interfering and he had no real power or clout in the movie world, so he couldn't really do much about it, and they were constantly changing the scripts and sometimes even shooting without any script at all. Fincher's movie career was almost over before it even began, but star Sigourney Weaver stood by him and said that they didn't let him do what he wanted to. Thankfully, he was able to move on and made movies like Seven, Fight Club, Panic Room, Zodiac, Curious Case of Benjamin Button, The Social Network, The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, Gone Girl, and The Killer. He's also worked on TV shows for Netflix like House of Cards and Mindhunter. For those of you who weren't around at the time, you do not realize how much of a media blitz there was around Alien 3. This was a movie that had tons of hype behind it, and in the end made almost $160 million at the box office on a $50 to $60 million budget. Part of this marketing, though, would be to make, yes, that's right, obviously it wouldn't be on this list otherwise, a video game. Acclaim published the game first on Sega Genesis in October of 1992, and later ports went to the Commodore 64, Game Gear, Super Nintendo Entertainment System, and Sega Master System. There was also an exclusive European port for the Amiga that was published by Virgin Interactive. The NES was also one of those later ports and came out through Acclaim's LJN label, and they tapped developer Probe Software to be able to create the game on all the platforms. In Alien 3, Ripley is the only survivor on the escape pod that left at the end of the second movie, and unfortunately she crash lands on a prison planet that is filled with a bunch of violent male inmates. While I don't really want to get into the whole weird thing about how they talk about they have double Y chromosomes, and I'm not really sure how that works, that doesn't really factor into the game at all, and you just still play as Ripley on this planet trying to fend off the aliens. While there is only one in the movie, you will be fighting multiple in the game, and also, unlike the movie, you're going to have way more weapons available to you, but this makes for a more fun game. Gameplay consists of being a side-scrolling run-and-gun game where you can run, jump, climb ladders, crawl through tunnels, open up doors, and use elevators to get around. Those previously mentioned weapons include using pulse rifles, flamethrowers, and grenades, and there is a time limit to each level, which consists of you finding and rescuing other prisoners that have been taken captive by the aliens. You have to not only find them all in time, but then also find the exit, and unfortunately this time limit is the biggest strike against the game. With no time limit involved, there's still quite a challenge to the game of trying to figure out the layouts of all the levels, where all the different prisoners are, and still trying to stay alive and figure out how to get to the next section. Some of those doors that I mentioned opening might hold off an alien from coming to get you, and you have to choose when to open it so you can take them on. This is the same overall concept of the Sega and Commodore versions of the game, but the NES version does have unique levels to it. Being a late-era NES game, the graphics are nice and colorful and have a decent amount of detail to them as well, especially when you consider the different little still-frame cutscenes that they have in between levels. As if the gameplay didn't get frustrating enough due to the strict timer, I found myself constantly losing track of time because I just was vibing to the music in the game. I was really quite surprised by how good the music was in this game, especially something that was a licensed title from LJN of all people. But it's just that good and some of the best that you will hear on the system. For those of you that watched the first part of this list, you'll know that I did a little bit of a bonus entry with the Game Boy version of Darkman, and I'm not really going to take the time to do that here with Alien 3. Yes, there is a Game Boy version. It was made by a different developer, Bit Studio, and it's a completely different game than ones on any other platform, but it's just frankly not good. It's an overhead perspective, more of an adventure game where you do exploration and finding items to solve basic puzzles, and it was just plain boring. So definitely move on from that one. Next up on the list is Mad Max, released in 1990. Based on Mad Max 2, aka The Road Warrior as we got it here in the US, which was a movie released on December 24th, 1981 in Australia. It is obviously yet again the second movie in the Mad Max franchise, which just recently got another entry with Furiosa. It's directed by George Miller, who also co-wrote it with two other writers, and he has been the director of every entry since. It stars Mel Gibson in the iconic role and takes place in a post-apocalyptic desert world, which is, Australia. After the events of the first movie, Mad Max is still a nomad who just scavenges around for food and gas, and he ends up finding an oil refinery, but it's always under attack by a biker gang led by Lord Humongous. Max says that he will help out defend against the gang, but in return that he gets some supplies. The Road Warrior went on to influence so many other things in popular culture when it comes to something being post-apocalyptic. Whenever you see something that has a certain type of imagery, it basically all dates back to the Road Warrior. The one that always comes to my mind is Fist of the North Star, but there are a million others. In 1988, developer Grey Matter made a game called Road Raider for home PCs, which was basically trying to be Mad Max without actually having the license, so it only makes sense to tap them to make a remake of their own game to make an actual Mad Max game. This particular Grey Matter was a Canadian studio that was established in 1985 but disbanded in 1997, so they are not to be confused with Grey Matter Studios, which made Return to Castle Wolfenstein and Call of Duty United Offensive. Mad Max was published by Mindscape, which was a company founded in October of 1983. They started off with computer software like the Mac Venture games, Deja Vu, Uninvited, and Shadowgate. They also made other famous titles like Mavis Beacon Teaches Typing, Roadrunner, Willow, James Bond 007 Goldfinger, and then they went on to make some NES games like Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, Paperboy, and of course, Mad Max. They continued on as a company until 2008 with their final game being called, yes, I'm not joking, Golden Balls, which I guess is based on a British game show? I don't know. Whatever, that's a weird way to go out, man. So as I mentioned, even though it's called Mad Max, it is based on Mad Max 2, so you are surviving in this post-apocalyptic world, and you survive by gathering food, water, gasoline, and money to keep going. You'll start off in levels that are known as Road Wars, and that is essentially you driving around in your car wherever you want within the confines of the map. There will be other vehicles out there that are going to come after you, and there's going to be towers throwing dynamite. There's also roadblocks that you can take out with dynamite of your own, and all your supplies are very limited, but you can gain more by exploring rundown service stations, and you die if ever your car is destroyed or you run out of gas. The other way to get more supplies in the game is to go out on foot in mines that you find where they have supplies hidden throughout maze-like levels. There will be other enemies there and you can fight them off with your gun, but again, your ammo is limited. On top of that, some doors may be locked and there are only a certain number of keys that you can find, so you have to be careful which doors you unlock. Sometimes you'll play the game and you unlock a door and there's just nothing in the room and it was a huge waste. The end goal is to be able to move on to make it to the arena and battle other enemies in their cars. To do this, you have to have enough goods to get an arena pass and then find the arena itself, which is a large cave. The arenas basically play out like a crazy demolition derby where you have to be the last one standing and fight off all the other enemies. You can push them into the pits that are on the sides or in the middle, but be careful because they're also trying to push you. There are also parts of the floor that open up, and if you're on top of it when they open, you'll fall and die as well. Everything shows its home computer roots while playing Mad Max, and that continues into the graphics and music, where everything is just very uninspired and even a bit drab and generic. There's not much of a color palette, and the music just doesn't really do anything for me. And third on the list, and just like before, it's really in no particular order, is RoboCop 2, released in 1991. Based on the movie of the same name, which was released in theaters on June 22nd, 1990, and starred Peter Weller and Nancy Allen reprising their roles from the first movie. This would be the last time that Peter Weller would play the role in movies, though he did come back in Mortal Kombat 11 and RoboCop Rogue City. Directed by Irvin Kershner, who famously directed Star Wars The Empire Strikes Back and James Bond Never Say Never Again, RoboCop 2 would be his final movie before his death in 2010. I think it's important to point out that the movie was also co-written by Frank Miller, who famously wrote comic books like Daredevil, The Dark Knight Returns, Sin City, and 300. RoboCop 2 takes place in a future dystopian Detroit where OCP, the Omni Consumer Products Corporation, is trying to bankrupt and take over the city. RoboCop is trying to stop that, as well as fighting a new street drug called Nuke and taking out the gangs that are spreading it. RoboCop 2 was not as successful as the original film, making $45 million worldwide compared to the original's $53 million, and the original also had a smaller budget. But nonetheless, the franchise continued on, and of course that meant we got a video game. Unfortunately for us, that meant that it was published and developed by, as we know them, the LJN of Europe, Ocean Software. In the first video that I made about R-rated NES games, I mentioned the RoboCop game that came out, which was one of my favorites as a kid growing up. Data East had made an arcade game, and they had to get the license from Ocean to be able to make an NES port. Unfortunately, no such thing happened for the arcade version of RoboCop 2, which sadly never got a home port, and instead RoboCop 2 on the NES is pretty much the same game that you got from other Ocean-developed home computer games. Once again, there is a Game Boy port of RoboCop 2, but it plays mostly the same, so there's no real point in continuing on. They're both going to have you run around and shoot enemies while collecting Nuke. Unlike the first game, you can jump this time, and it's all shooting, there's no punching. Once you finish a level, it will tell you how many of the enemies that you, as they put it, arrested, but let's be honest, you shot them in the face. And if you didn't get enough of those enemies, then you have to do a training level, which is essentially a shooting gallery. If you don't do well enough there too, then you have to replay the whole level all over again. If that wasn't frustrating enough as it is, there will be parts of the levels where you're going to be up above and enemies will be below you and you can't get to them, or vice versa. So it makes it very difficult to get the right number of people. And then you slide around like you're on ice. It's like he's on ice skates and just kind of floating around everywhere. It's super frustrating and not easy to play at all. The sprites are bigger than the original NES game and have a bit more detail, but that's at the cost of having less on screen. And then things just look weird, like you have these giant fire hydrants for no reason whatsoever, and the barrels just look all disproportionate. So yeah, they're bigger and more detailed, but I wouldn't necessarily call them better. The music and sound effects also show their home computer roots, as they're basically just the generic bleeps and bloops with some odd and annoying sound effects. And fourth on the list is The Terminator, released on December of 1992. Despite the fact that Terminator 2 had already come out, this is a game based on the original Terminator from 1984. That movie was directed by James Cameron, who did Aliens, The Abyss, True Lies, Titanic, and the Avatar series. In the original Terminator, it starred Arnold Schwarzenegger as the Terminator in a rare villain appearance, at least until he became Mr. Freeze. He is a machine that's been sent from the future to kill Sarah Connor, played by Linda Hamilton, whose unborn son will one day lead the resistance against Skynet, which is AI! Kyle Reese, played by Michael Biehn, is a soldier sent back from the future to protect her. It was distributed by Orion Pictures, which also did RoboCop, and it grossed $78.3 million on a low $6.4 million budget. The franchise obviously has carried on, and there have been many video games. This one game on the NES is actually unrelated to the Genesis, Game Gear, and Sega CD versions, so sorry fans of Tommy Tallarico. A year prior to this game coming out, there actually was a DOS game which was the first Terminator game ever released and was developed by Bethesda. Yes, that Bethesda. That was a game I actually had as a kid, and again, is completely different. Sunsoft had actually been trying to develop a Terminator game for the NES, but they ended up losing the license, and they turned it into Journey to Silius in 1990. Supposedly, they had lost the license for not following the plot of the movie enough, and instead focusing on Kyle Reese fighting Skynet in the future, but that's also what the Sega games did, so that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to me. The Terminator game that we did end up getting was published by Mindscape, which I just talked about with Mad Max, and developed by Radical Entertainment. Radical Entertainment was a Canadian developer that was known later on for games like The Simpsons Hit and Run, Scarface The World Is Yours, and Prototype 2, as well as entries in the Crash Bandicoot series. They developed the Terminator the same year as The Adventures of Rocky and Bullwinkle and Friends on the NES, which were their first games. As of 2022, all that was left of Radical Entertainment, though, was a team of 6 employees whose work would be credited under Activision Vancouver, although it was specifically named in the Activision acquisition by Microsoft. The game loosely follows the plot of the movie, where you start in the future playing as Kyle Reese and you fight your way to go back to 1984 Los Angeles, and you continue fighting through different points of the movie. It's your standard run and gun type game with some platforming to go along with the shooting, but unfortunately I just found it a bit frustrating. You have this weird way where you have to crouch whenever you want to shoot, and you can't move while you do it, and the jumping's all floaty. It's just not very well made, unfortunately. There were so many better games out there, even within the same franchise. I probably could have played a bit more to be able to get further along, but I just didn't see the point. While the whole point of this list was the fact that it was an NES game, I found that the Sega versions were much better. They were shooters made by Probe yet again for the Genesis, Master System, and Game Gear that were all relatively similar, and then the Sega CD version was yet another game with better graphics, better music, and even used full motion video. There was a Super Nintendo game as well, but that one wasn't as good. Okay, and before we move on to the 5th game, you guys caught me. Yep, I'm going to give you another bonus game, and that would be RoboCop vs. the Terminator, or RoboCop vs. Terminator. Now you might be asking yourself, wait a minute, I don't remember that game. And you'd be right, and that's why this is just a bonus one. It was never actually released. RoboCop vs. the Terminator came out on the Super Nintendo, Master System, and Game Gear in 1993, with the Genesis and Game Boy versions coming out in 1994. The NES version was planned and worked on, but it was never completed and therefore never released. But you know how the internet works, and here you go. It is out there for you to be able to play. This is also a bonus because technically it's based on a comic book series, but the comic books were based on movies, so you're really arguing semantics at that point. The game does have the Interplay logo in it, listing them as the developer, but I'm not 100% sure if that's accurate or something that somebody maybe added later on. But what is for sure is the game would have been published by Virgin Interactive Entertainment, as they published all the other versions on the different platforms. For an incomplete, unreleased game, it certainly is still quite a bit of fun. It's a run and gun type game with some platforming elements. You'll be climbing ladders, going on conveyor belts, all while shooting the robots. You can collect some upgraded weapons, but it doesn't seem like that they make that much of a difference, and I don't know if that was just a bad game design or just a result of the fact that the game wasn't finished. The sprites are a bit on the small side, but it does lead to the game running nice and smooth, and it just led to some nice fast gameplay. There's not a ton of detail, but you do know what everything is supposed to be. And again, it was unfinished, so who knows what it really could have been had they taken the time, but it was late in the life, so I do understand why they would have canceled something like this. The music is also surprisingly decent for something that wasn't finished, but I'm also unsure if it was maybe taken from something else and just used as a placeholder. Alright everybody, you've hung in this long. Now it's time for our final game on the list of NES games based on R-rated movies, and that's Hudson Hawk, released in 1991. Well, some sources say February of 92, but you know how it goes with these older games, and I believe the Japanese version came out in 91, so I'm still gonna roll with it. Hudson Hawk the movie was released in theaters on May 24th, 1991, and starred Bruce Willis, Danny Aiello, Andy McDowell, Sandra Bernhardt, James Coburn, David Caruso, and, quick change the channel, Zangief himself, Andrew Berniarski, as well as, you guessed it, Frank Stallone. The plot follows Eddie Hawkins, aka Hudson Hawk, who is one of the world's best thieves who just got out of spending a 10-year prison sentence. Unfortunately, he gets caught up in something where he's forced to steal Da Vinci works of art for a world domination plot. This was Bruce Willis's only attempt at screenwriting, and he ended up getting a story credit along with Robert Kraft, who also this would be his only writing credit since he was more known for music, and they ended up writing the theme song together. A couple of actual screenwriters in Hollywood did write the screenplay for the movie, but frequent on-set script rewrites were a result of Bruce Willis just throwing ideas around. The movie has a very cartoony, slapstick, bizarre humor to it, yet it was marketed as an action movie due to the success of Die Hard 2 the previous year. Some examples of this would be like the fact that you have villains that are named after candy bars, and Hudson would sing specific songs so that he would know how much time that he was spending while stealing things. This movie was not well received, a huge critical and commercial failure, only grossing $17 million domestically on a $65 million budget. It did do better internationally with an additional $80 million, and it would eventually turn a profit, but the bottom line was that people didn't like it, and it even earned 3 Razzies, including Worst Picture. With that said, I'm not gonna lie, this was one of my favorite movies growing up, and one of my wife's too, and it was one of our earliest bonding experiences that we were the only people who legitimately enjoyed watching Hudson Hawk. But since the movie was a flop, a planned SNES version that was in development was canceled, so all that was released were the Game Boy and NES titles, as well as some home computer versions. Seeing that it was published by Sony ImageSoft, which makes sense because Sony owned the company that put the movie out, and developed by Special Effects Limited, I thought maybe we would have a little bit better of a game than we actually got, but it turns out that Ocean Software released the computer versions elsewhere, and Special Effects Limited was started by former Ocean employees and basically did all of their games but one under Ocean. So yeah, you know what you're getting. Hudson Hawk would actually be the last game made by Special Effects Limited, and Ocean would take over the company and just decided to fold it. That's how good it was. Ocean was like, you're done. The story follows the movie where you have to steal the Da Vinci artifacts, and it's a platformer where you play as Hudson Hawk, avoiding alarms, lasers, traps, and things of that sort while you break into a building. There are security guards around as well as dogs that show up that can be avoided or taken out. Although the dogs can never be totally taken out, you can only stun them. You do this by throwing what I guess are baseballs. Some sources say that they're tennis balls, but they're white, and you can use them by throwing them at them, or you can punch when you're close by. I'm not gonna lie, I liked the actual idea behind the game, but unfortunately the execution just takes all that away. Not only does it control sluggishly and it's hard to be precise with your jumping, but if you do anything that causes a problem for you to fall, you actually have to go back part of the level and redo a whole bunch of stuff that you've already done. If you feel like playing the Game Boy version, it's very, very similar with the same level setup, but there are some changes here and there, especially with the fact that there are more items that are made to be bouncy that you can jump off of. There are also more items to collect along the way. The main character sprite does have the trademark sunglasses that Hudson Hawk wears in the movie, but other than that, looks absolutely nothing like the character. I briefly tried out the Commodore 64 version to be able to do a comparison, and the NES version is barely better both graphically and in the sound department. The music is just as annoying as the other games that I've mentioned that they've made, so really, there's definitely a theme going here. So there you have it, 5 more NES games based on R-rated movies, plus a bonus one that was never actually released. They weren't all bad, so which ones did you play as a kid, and which ones would you even still play now? Are there other games that you would like to see on a future list? Let us know in the comments below. Thanks again for watching, and until next time, enjoy gaming.